Yeah, and that brings me to like the broader issue of money in politics, specifically related to the Gaza situation. There have been attempts to pass legislation like the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which would the ACLU has clearly said it's unconstitutional. But Democrats like Cory Booker, they're co-sponsoring it, they're voting for it. It's no secret that these people take money from AIPAC. So does your opponent, Diane Degette, right? Am I saying your name right there?
Diana Degette,
She
yeah.
takes Diana Degette, yeah. She takes money from AIPAC. Her biggest donor is actually the healthcare industry. She's just taken so much money from the healthcare lobby. So talk to us about your pledge to not take any super PAC money at all. And what is your PhD so far kind of informed you about this?
Yeah. So the number one thing that we have to understand when we're talking about this issue of money in politics is that while we would like for the number one motivation of our elected officials to be to represent us rightly and to represent our interests, their number one concern is actually getting reelected. And when we're talking about 2-year term limits in the House and their perception of how to actually be ineffective, that really leads to wanting long-term power and long-term, stay in the House. And so how do you win elections? Money. And so while it would make more sense in a representative democracy that they were actually focused on our interests, the only way that they think they can pass policies and be effective in Congress is by ensuring that they get reelected. They can continue to get the kind of relationships and leadership positions that comes with being in office for a longer period of time. And so if the motivation is to get reelected and the only mode of getting reelected effectively, at least consistently in this country for the last few decades, has been money, they're going to cozy up to these interests and these corporations that have that kind of money to offer. And the thing is that money does not come free, right? Oftentimes we see that the money and the interests that are behind that money are going to line up to what that elected official ends up actually doing when they're in office. The difficult thing that I think is, where a lot of Democrats are struggling to wrap their heads around this is that they don't actually see themselves as being corrupt, right? They think, yeah, I'm taking this money, but I'm still doing this, I'm still voting this way, or I'm still fighting to do this for my constituents. But the thing about money and how it corrupts the way you think is that it's very subtle and it's very quiet, but it seeps in there, and over time it becomes extremely effective, especially when your only, or at least your number one motivation is to get reelected. And so I think it's really important to talk about this issue of money in politics, not to say that, these elected officials are evil and corrupt and they don't care about the American people. Most of them do. Most of them think that what they're doing is just, a means to an end. But what we have to do is show them the data and the evidence that the money that is in our politics and pervading our government is actually working entirely against American interests, entirely against the notions of a representative democracy. There was a study done a few years ago that showed that if there is a policy that the American people really, really like 80% approval, and then there's another policy that the American people really hate, 10% approval, that bill still has a 30% chance of passing because the American
Yeah.
people opinions don't actually matter anymore. What does make a massive difference is whether or not corporations and the lobbying class have an interest in that legislation. If they do, the chances of it passing are wildly higher. That is not a representative democracy. That truly is corruption at its highest form in our government. We have to find a way to explain this to Democrats that are in power and in leadership in the same way that we're talking about it with the American people. But the American people, I think, are already on board, right? I think the biggest the problem that's in our party is that they like to think that they treat our voters like they're stupid. And it's ridiculous, and it's so infuriating when you talk, and as an ordinary person, you're talking with people every day. Everyone knows the government and the system is rigged. We know this. Even if people don't know the exact mechanisms for how that's happening, people know something's off. And for Democrats to just kind of hide and pretend and say, well, no, it's not on our end, the jig is up. Like people know that this isn't working anymore and we have to address it.
Yeah, and I think you're being a little kind. It's absolutely right that sometimes it can be an implicit corruption and people don't even realize it. But sometimes it's very straightforward. For example, if we take a look at your opponent, Diana Degette, she somewhere around 2009, the like early Obama era, she was actually talking about a universal healthcare system, like a single payer healthcare system.
Hmm.
And it's all you need to do is follow the money. The healthcare industry money came in and she flipped and she started talking about the Affordable Care Act. And I just want to take a second here to talk about the Affordable Care Act. It's touted as this big liberal victory, but the initial legislation was drafted at the Heritage Foundation, right?
Hmm.
It's the same people who drafted Project 2025. And it was Mitt Romney, Republican, who introduced it at the state level in Massachusetts. And, they made it the Affordable Care Act on the federal level. So it's a Republican piece of legislation, which has been watered down even further. And somehow it's a big liberal victory. It makes no sense.
Yeah. So first, I do want to clarify that Congresswoman Degette is actually a co-sponsor on Medicare for All. But I think that points to a larger problem in the establishment where there are folks that vote the right way or co-sponsor legislation that seemingly is progressive, but then never talk about it, never champion it. And it almost feels like a shield that's used to kind of just ward off any criticism. I think that's my biggest concern with the folks that are in the party, that I do think that they think they're doing good. And of course, there are folks that you mentioned that are, very explicit about the way that their corruption has led the way that they legislate in Congress. But I did want to make just that one point of clarification. But specifically when it comes to Medicare for All, it is the most efficient, effective, and economical policy solution we have today to achieving universal health care in this country. I have always been of the belief that our basic needs have to be guaranteed on some level, and that includes healthcare. And, it's not just about it being the right thing to do, right? I don't believe anyone should ever go bankrupt or have to have any financial concerns over illnesses that they have literally no control over. But on top of that, it is also the most pragmatic thing to do. The way that we run healthcare in this country right now is completely inefficient. It is actually exacerbating a lot of the health problems that Americans are facing today in this country. And it only serves to line the interests and the pockets of these healthcare companies, and there's these health insurance companies and big pharmaceutical companies. And so I think we have to be really honest and also very clear about why is it that Medicare for All makes sense beyond it just being, I think the right thing to do. And so for Medicare for All, we're talking about thousands of dollars that are being saved for every individual, whether we're talking about general healthcare costs or the premiums that they would be saving. But we're also talking about the impact of preventative care. If we ensure that every single American has access to a primary doctor where they can get that regular checkup, we're talking about so many chronic diseases that could be caught early. We're talking about, much more deeper emphasis on the impact of just diet and exercise and how that could reduce a lot of the chronic diseases that we're seeing in this country today as well. And we see in other developed countries that the having a program of universal health care is directly correlated with positive health outcomes and also life expectancy generally. And it's just one of those things where it's such an obvious solution to the problems that we're facing. And it's something like 60+% of Americans supports Medicare for All, but we don't see that legislation getting anywhere in Congress because of the influence and the impact of the lobbying that is being done by big pharmaceutical companies, by the healthcare insurance companies. And I'm glad that you mentioned the Affordable Care Act because it is a piece of legislation that did have so much influence from these industries that ended up actually benefiting from them. And I talked about that recently in a video about I use the United Health Group as an example and how the Affordable Care Act allowed for there to be this loophole of sorts where they could create the middleman and now they're paying themselves through. It's just such a convoluted and ridiculous system that the American people are paying for, not just with their money, but with their lives at the end of the day. And so we just have to do better. And it's frustrating to know that we have a solution that it's so effective. It would work. It would do so well and it would save lives. But we're up against all of this money and all of this influence from these lobbies.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad, after, Degette took office in 1990, I think.
Mhm.
So, after 28 years, I'm glad she's finally caught on to the Medicare for All train. I mean, I think over 105 co-sponsors or something co-sponsored it, the most recent version of it. So she's finally jumping on the bandwagon. So that's nice to see. But she has been very pro-corporate for the last 2 decades
Mhm.
when it comes to healthcare.
Hey there, if you liked that video, then subscribe to my channel, click on the link in my bio to follow me on Instagram, X, and more.